All right. So I want to talk about why I created zone detriment, how that happened, uh, what my process was of bringing that to life, and why. Why would I create something like that? I feel on the surface, a lot of people probably think I'm just like angry and like trying to spread hate and all this. And like, if it comes off that way, whatever. But like, there's a lot more to it. And I'd like to get into that a little bit. This is going to be some of the heaviest, realest shit I've probably ever shared in a video format. So for those of you that this is way over the top, like just keep scrolling. That's okay. But I think the reason I want to share this is because I think some of you may get something from this, and who knows? So this project originally came about when maybe about 3 years ago. I was in this place where my reality was chaos. I was working a job that I hated. I was hanging around people that just so blatantly contradicted my beliefs and the things I was learning at the time that it was just fighting all the time. And during that period of time, one of my close family members became fatally ill. So, funny enough, at this period of time, I was developing a more spiritual faculty, but had this like innate darkness that I just couldn't deny. I couldn't ignore it. And through this process of working with this family member and basically doing energy work with her, doing psychology, working to remove all of the programming and all of the heavy nonsense that was keeping her at the vibration that was taking her life, essentially. So I got to see that very firsthand, night by night by night, watching this person just slowly go from life to death. And during this time, it was just like I was in the dark. And it was like the only thing I knew how to do to compensate for that was like be in the dark, embrace that. Like it was just sort of a crazy mentality in reality. Like I guess I wouldn't say I recommend anyone tries this. Like just fully embracing the dark and say like F everything else. But basically, what ended up happening after however many months of watching this family member like in extreme suffering and pain and doing everything that I could to like mitigate that pain and get that energy to go somewhere else so when she moved on from her body it wouldn't be such a cycle. Um, this individual, when the night that she passed away, I was not with her. The night before, I was doing energy work with her and I was working on her solar plexus and I was like, I need to spin this thing. Like I need to get it moving. I need to. And normally with energy work, you're not trying to invoke your will on someone else's energy. You're trying to stimulate their energy centers so they can get it going. But this was literally just a dire situation. It was like, okay, we got to get this moving. Like to keep this person alive, to keep this person living. And after that night, I was exhausted. The next day, I was like, I don't have anything more to give to this, and I don't know if it would even be effective if I did. So the next day, instead of staying with her that night, I was at home and I was meditating. I was just laying in my bed, just kind of in that space. I was definitely in a space, and I heard a voice. Just said, "Hey, Daniel." I was like, "What? Hello." And I had no idea. I had no idea what it was. It was just, I mean, it wasn't like a voice in my head. It was like someone was in my room, and I heard a voice, and that caught me off guard a little bit. I was like, did I just hear a voice? Did someone just talk to me? I just said hello back, and then I saw a figure that was purple, like a figure that was purple that came down over the top of me, and like bounced right off of my solar plexus. And in that moment, all of the energy that I had expelled the night before came back to me, and it was one of the craziest experiences. For the reason that I went totally manic shortly after I understood what had happened, that she had passed and that was her, and she gave my energy back. But this energy that I got back all of a sudden had these codes in it. And I mean, even before this, I was getting interested in like these ticks and dashes, and I was just like, oh man, like, what is this? What's this language? How is this done? And later in that night, I was just manic. I was like not on Earth. I was somewhere else, and when I was sort of out of my body almost. But I sat down with a notepad and I just started writing ticks and dashes, and it was like 2 full pages of these ticks and dashes, like line by line. And I learned then that that was some form of coded message. So I turned that into music, which that record I haven't released yet. Origins was like the process of that. The next record I'm releasing later this year, called Enigma, was actually the record that I made off of these ticks and dashes. Like, it was that pretty much to a T. So that didn't come about until later, though. I wasn't able to correctly interpret these until I had an experience many years later with experiencing my own death. So this came through an ayahuasca ceremony, and this was after like probably the pinnacle of like the spiritual sort of mindset that I had been living, where I was doing energy work with people, I was doing psychology work with people, I was working in a metaphysical place. Like, I was in this mindset, and I was like, and then when that all came to pass and I found myself sort of back in my like, okay, like this dark is still here, this dark is still here, I found this like moral contrast where I was like having this desire to be this like person on this higher wavelength and be someone who's like actually spreading good vibes and whatnot in the world, but finding that I could not deny this aspect of myself that was darker. So in this period of time, like, I just had a night where I just impulsively, and it's not like I hadn't been considering this for time, like, I know how to work with these plant teachers, but I was just like, I should just go to ayahuasca. I was like, this is a good time to do it. And I did. And the first night I was there, in the first ceremony, I ended up basically going through this process where I came to like the absolute lowest of the low of the low. Like, this feeling of like death is inevitable, like you're gonna die, this is the end of you right now, and feeling exactly what that felt like, which, because of that experience, I can understand why people fear death. I can understand why it's something that people are afraid of, and why people work so much off of survival mechanisms, like, I'm trying not to die, and people are afraid of death like it's this bad thing, and it's not. So after I gave into that, that's what happened. I passed on. I experienced death. I wasn't in my body, I wasn't out of my body, I was somewhere else. But it was like, I knew that that's what it was because I remembered it. I remembered myself being there before I came here to be this person. And in that space, everything was just, it was all good. There was nothing. I can't explain the feeling to you. It's just like absolute peace, absolute, like, there's nothing that could be wrong or could have possibly been wrong. Like, outside of the realm of duality, there's no longer any good or bad. And this is the nature of the soul. It's this neutral place. So being in this space, I was like, oh, everything's fine now. I've left that all behind. I've done that. And when I came back, and I don't think I actually, like, for real came back for several months after this, but when I initially, like, okay, I'm back in my body, it was like all the rage and madness and dark and all of this was still there. It was like still there and as potent as ever. And I was like, what's going on? Like, what's up with this? Why is this way? And within this, I learned sort of a contrast that exists within spirituality, where through spending all the time that I did working with spiritually minded people who are always focused on the good and the love and the light, which there's nothing wrong with that. But here's a counter perspective. If you are this infinite soul that is just exists in this space of bliss, and you know that it's inevitable that you go back there, I mean, if you choose to go back there, then why then would you on Earth spend your life trying to get back there when you know you're going to get back there regardless? See, it's like, this is the contrast that I found. We have this mentality that, like, oh, like, only good and only light and only love and only this, but we don't realize that when we separate ourselves like that and you deny these other darker, less attractive aspects of yourself, you are separating yourself, you're segregating yourself in the middle, and you trap yourself in 3D. Meaning you're always going to be making decisions based off of duality and based off of a fear of survival. Because people are fundamentally afraid of their shadow, which is why. People are fundamentally, like, afraid of their dark, they're afraid of their shadow, and you have all these people that are like, oh no, like, I don't do that. Love and light. Do you see the contradiction here? Why, if we were coming here to have an experience other than that blissed out soul that you are, if you came here to Earth to have a human experience, why are you trying to have an experience that's not human? So I learned then, being back in my body after having been there and having all of this dark energy still going on, that It's sort of in Zen, they call this the archetype of the Joker, where it's like if one all of a sudden becomes aware that everyone's just wearing a mask and you have an identity, then wouldn't the game then be to see how far away could I get from my real self before I inevitably go back there? So in a sense, this is why zone detriment came about. It was this idea that the real awakening process, like the real awakening to what is process, is destructive. It's not, everyone thinks it's this like, oh, and I'm just going to feel better and better eventually, because eventually you get to a place where you're not in duality anymore. So it's like the suffering is mitigated. You can be in the dark or the light or experiencing either one, but you're in the center of that. So this process of awakening, and as the way this world is set up, we've all grown up with these programs that are functional to make the system function. Which the system and culture, I say this all the time, but culture is not your friend. Culture is not something that is looking to get you aligned with you and get you into the power that you innately already hold as the creator being that you are. Like, these systems are not built for that. These systems are built to get you to obey, to get you to keep you in that duality and that fear right there. So the process of removing this programming is quite destructive. And that's sort of how I ended up approaching it. I then, at this period of time after coming back, ended up, my mind couldn't handle it. Like, shortly after this period of time, it was just like, I'd been through all this nonsense, like dark and whatever, and I'm not trying to say, oh, woe is me, this happened. This was just my experience and what I did with it. But going through that, my mind couldn't handle it, and shortly after I came back into the real world and was like in this bliss place, and then okay, now I'm back in the programs, I'm back around the people that are holding the programs with like no judgment to anybody, but like my mind couldn't handle it, and I cracked like completely. And it was just like I stopped caring about everything. I developed this like resentment for the world. This was also a month before the pandemic went down. So this is February 14th, I think, in 2020. And I basically like went and I died, and then I came back into reality, and I was like, wow, like, okay, we could do some stuff here. And then the world like, and I mean, I was pissed. And I wasn't going to lie about that. I wasn't trying to not be angry. I wasn't trying to not be like upset about something, because I wasn't trying to repress that energy anymore. I wanted to be authentic. I wanted to let what was happening with me happen with me. And throughout that next year, I basically enveloped myself in this like obsessive creative process where I just shut everything out and needed to create these codes and turn them into what they were. And through this process, I mean, at this period of time, like, I was shattered. It was like my whole idea of what I was and who I was and like how this whole thing functioned were just gone. And the only thing that I could really cling to, in a sense, at that period of time was this emotion that I had. It was like this was the only thing that was actually proving to me that I was alive and that I was living. And then it wasn't just like, everything's pointless, we're all going to die anyways. Like, whatever. Why are you taking things so seriously? So I sort of decided to take the anti-perspective. And maybe this wasn't a super healthy train of thought, but it led to me taking these codes and turning it into the next record, which, like I said, I'll probably be releasing sometime this year. But through this process and through actually expressing these things and allowing my shadow to have a place, like not trying to repress these aspects and pretend I'm all a good person, like fundamentally loving and caring for other people. Like, I want to see people do well, but then on the other end, like, I'm no longer able to see death as a threat. So even when I see all these people in the world that over this period of time were all terrified, like, oh, my life and like, oh, my health and all this, and they're just so afraid of death. Like, I was mad about that. And it was just like, and I see it differently now, but at that period of time, it was like, I need to say this in a way that I can say this. And that was through music. And it was this sort of understanding that it's like, death and life go hand in hand. It's like, you can't have one without the other. You can't have the light without the dark. You can't have the happy without the sad. You're always in the center of those. You're neither. Your soul, and this is even when people are saying like, lives matter and this lives matter. Lives are matter. Lives are not matter. Lives are not matter. Life and life, that is your soul. That is the soul, that is the breath, that is the alive. The matter is the other end of that. That's how the two come together. You have the ether and the earth, or the heaven and the earth, as they call it, and that's how these two come together. So when you have all these people out saying dead lives matter, Or you have all these people that are so afraid that, like, oh, I might die and I need this thing to prevent death. What are you trying to prevent? That is an ego construct. That is an ego construct that you're still buying into duality. You're still buying into separation. So within zone detriment, this was my way to sort of express that. This was my way to sort of put a label on, like, people see death as like the ultimate undoing. And that's what it means. Zone detriment. If you could think of like the worst, like a black hole that is just like would swallow everything, and people look at death that way, it's just like, oh, it stops. And we're gone now. And that's bad, because that's not human anymore. That's bad for your human, but you're not a human. You're a soul experiencing a human. So this construct, well, like I said, it's not based on hate and rage and things like that. It was my way to express that, but ultimately my goal was to try to take that energy and transmute it in a way that I could take these codes and maybe decimate some of the programming that people had, if they were even willing to let go of that programming. So I think some of you may not resonate with this at all, but some of you, like, it's just important to know that, and this is what I've had to learn in the last few years, that like everybody's on their own wavelength with this journey. Like, this was my way of like facing my dark and facing the shadow and like actually expressing some things and getting rid of my own programming that I had grown up with, and like my journey through that. And like when you choose to do that, you tend to separate, and you don't separate yourself, but you tend to become less relatable to people, because you find yourself interacting with people that are still operating on these bandwidths of fear and uncertainty, where they don't know, and they're just afraid, and they're just listening, and it's this herd mentality, and they're scared. And like, I've learned that like that used to piss me off. That used to really upset me, and it wasn't like, oh, why is this person so dumb? It was more like, I wish they could see what I could see, and I wish they could know these things in the way that I know them, so they don't have to go through this.